The morning sun streamed through the tall glass windows of Kennedy International Airport as travelers rushed about, each focused on their own journey. Among them walked a tall man in his early 40s, moving with purpose through the crowded terminal. This was Thomas Wilson, the founder and CEO of Digital Front Technologies, a company he had built from nothing into a billion-dollar enterprise over 15 hard-fought years. Thomas checked his watch, 7:30 a.m. Perfect timing. His flight to San Francisco was scheduled for 9:15 a.m., giving him plenty of time to clear security and review his presentation notes before boarding. The quarterly board meeting tomorrow would determine the direction of their new cybersecurity platform, and Thomas had spent weeks preparing for it. As he walked, Thomas adjusted his navy blue suit jacket, custom-tailored but understated. He had learned long ago that true power didn't need flashy displays. His only notable accessories were his platinum wedding band and the sleek, expensive watch his team had given him after securing their first major contract. His leather briefcase held his laptop, tablet, and the documents he'd been reviewing late into the night. People occasionally glanced his way as he passed. Thomas was used to it. Being one of the few black CEOs in the tech industry still turned heads, especially outside of Silicon Valley. He had learned to carry himself with quiet confidence, to enter every room as if he belonged there, because he did. Thomas pulled out his phone to check an incoming message. His wife had sent a photo of their daughter's science project, a working model of the solar system she completed for school. He smiled and typed back, "Tell her I'm proud. We'll call when I land." Family had always been his anchor, keeping him grounded as his professional life soared to heights his parents could never have imagined. The terminal was buzzing with the usual morning rush. Business travelers in suits tapping on laptops, families corralling excited children, airport staff directing the flow of human traffic. Thomas navigated through it all with practiced ease, having flown this route dozens of times before. "Morning, sir," nodded a barista at the coffee stand he frequented on his trips. "The usual." "You remembered." Thomas smiled, accepting the black coffee with a nod of thanks. These small moments of recognition always pleased him. He left his usual generous tip and continued toward security. Thomas pulled up his boarding pass on his phone and joined the TSA ProCheck line. His company's travel coordinator had arranged everything as usual: priority boarding, aisle seat in business class, car service waiting in San Francisco. The efficiency allowed him to focus on what mattered: the innovations his team was developing. As he waited, Thomas's mind drifted to how far he had come. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, computers had been his escape and his passion. He had worked his way through college on scholarships and part-time jobs, then climbed the corporate ladder before taking the leap to start his own company. Now, Digital Front Technologies employed over 500 people and had offices in 3 countries. The line moved forward steadily. Thomas texted his chief operating officer about a last-minute change to the presentation. Around him, the busy airport hummed with announcements, conversations, and the rolling of luggage. It was just another Tuesday morning, another business trip, another day in the life he had worked so hard to build. He had no way of knowing that in less than 30 minutes, everything would change. That his identity, his accomplishments, even his basic rights would be questioned. That a routine trip would turn into a viral moment that would spark national conversation. That the respect he had earned through decades of hard work would be stripped away in seconds, only to transform into something more powerful than he could have imagined. As Thomas approached the security checkpoint, he put away his phone and prepared his ID and boarding pass. He had done this countless times before. But something felt different today, a subtle shift in the air. A change in the way the TSA agent was looking at him. Thomas took a deep breath and stepped forward, unaware that he was walking into a storm. Thomas joined the security line, sliding his laptop into a gray bin along with his shoes and belt. He'd done this hundreds of times before. The routine was second nature. The line moved steadily, business travelers efficiently preparing their items with practiced movements. Thomas noticed a white executive in front of him, nodding to the TSA agent before passing through without a second glance. Just another Tuesday morning. When Thomas stepped up and handed over his ID and boarding pass, something shifted. The TSA agent's eyes lingered on his face, then moved to the ID, then back to his face again. The smile that had greeted other travelers disappeared. "Sir, I need you to step to the side for additional screening," the agent said, voice flat. Thomas blinked in surprise. "Is there a problem with my documents?" "No, sir." Random selection. The agent's tone suggested there was nothing to discuss. Thomas looked around. The pre-check line was filled with business travelers like himself, but he couldn't help noticing he was the only black person in sight, and the only one being pulled aside. "I have TSA pre-check status," Thomas explained calmly, pointing to the marking on his boarding pass, "and my flight boards in less than an hour." "Random selection, sir," the agent repeated, more firmly this time. "Please step to the side." A second agent approached and motioned Thomas toward a separate screening area. Thomas took a deep breath and followed. He'd been through this before, not often, but enough times to recognize what was happening. Still, he maintained his professional demeanor, the same one that had guided him through countless difficult business negotiations. At the secondary screening area, a different agent gestured for Thomas to spread his arms and legs. The agent's hands moved roughly over Thomas's expensive suit, patting down areas that had already been cleared by the scanner. Thomas kept his face neutral despite his growing frustration. "Your briefcase needs additional inspection," the agent said, pulling on blue gloves. Thomas watched as the agent rummaged through his carefully organized papers, his fingers pressing heavily on the keys of his laptop. When the agent roughly flipped the computer over, nearly dropping it, Thomas finally spoke up. "Excuse me," he said politely. "That laptop contains sensitive company information. Could you please handle it with a bit more care?" The agent looked up sharply. "Are you telling me how to do my job?" "Not at all," Thomas replied, keeping his voice level. "I'm just concerned about the equipment." The agent's face hardened. "I need a supervisor over here," he called out loudly, never breaking eye contact with Thomas. "We have someone being uncooperative." Thomas felt a cold sensation in his stomach. Around him, other travelers began to stare. Some looked away uncomfortably. Others watched with undisguised curiosity. A woman nearby gave him a sympathetic glance before being ushered forward in her line. "I'm being completely cooperative," Thomas said quietly. "I simply asked you to be careful with my property." A supervisor appeared. A short man with thinning hair and a permanent frown. The agent leaned in and whispered something, occasionally glancing in Thomas's direction. Thomas couldn't hear the words, but he recognized the look that crossed the supervisor's face. He had seen it before in other situations where his authority was questioned simply because of how he looked. "Sir, would you come with me, please?" The supervisor said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "May I ask why?" Thomas kept his voice steady, though his heart rate had picked up. "You've been flagged for additional questioning," the supervisor replied vaguely. "This way, please." As Thomas gathered his belongings, he noticed other travelers watching. Some had their phones out, recording discreetly. Thomas straightened his shoulders and walked with dignity, aware that everything about his body language would be judged. With each step, he reminded himself of who he was, a CEO, a father, a respected business leader. But with each step, he also felt those identities being stripped away, replaced by assumptions and suspicions based solely on the color of his skin. Little did he know, things were about to get much worse. Thomas followed the supervisor through the security area, aware of the eyes tracking his movement. The supervisor walked quickly, as if rushing to contain a situation before it got out of hand. Thomas kept pace, his mind racing ahead to his flight. He checked his watch, still enough time if this wrapped up quickly. "In here," the supervisor said, gesturing toward a small room off the main concourse. The door had a keypad lock and no windows. Thomas hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. The room contained a metal table bolted to the floor, 3 plastic chairs, and a camera in the corner with its red light blinking steadily. The walls were bare except for a framed copy of security protocols. Thomas had seen conference rooms in struggling startups with more personality than this space. "Please have a seat," the supervisor said, not sitting down himself. Instead, he stood with his arms crossed, looking down at Thomas. A power move Thomas recognized from countless business negotiations. "Can you tell me what this is about?" Thomas asked calmly, placing his briefcase on the table. Before the supervisor could answer, the door opened again. 2 more TSA officers entered. A tall woman with her hair pulled back tightly and a broad-shouldered man whose uniform seemed a size too small for his frame. "This the one giving Matthews trouble?" the man asked, as if Thomas wasn't sitting right there. "I haven't given anyone trouble," Thomas said. "I simply asked an agent to handle my laptop with care." The female officer stepped forward. "Sir, when TSA officers give instructions, we expect compliance, not arguments." "I didn't argue," Thomas explained, keeping his voice even. "I made a reasonable request about my property, which contains sensitive company information." The supervisor cut in, his voice rising slightly. "Your tone was reported as aggressive and uncooperative." Thomas took a deep breath. He'd been in this situation before, having his normal speaking voice labeled as aggressive when he was merely being direct. It was a familiar pattern, one he'd navigated many times throughout his career. "I spoke exactly as I'm speaking now," Thomas said. "If you have security footage with audio, I'm happy for you to review it." The male officer stepped closer, invading Thomas's personal space. "Are you suggesting our agent is lying?" Thomas didn't back down, but he didn't escalate either. 15 years of high-stakes business meetings had taught him how to stay composed when others tried to provoke him. "I'm suggesting there may have been a misunderstanding," he said carefully. The room grew tense. Outside, announcement speakers called for boarding on a flight to Chicago. Thomas thought of his own flight, of the presentation waiting on his laptop, of his team expecting his leadership at tomorrow's meeting. "Empty your pockets, please," the female officer instructed, changing tactics. Thomas complied, placing his phone, wallet, and keys on the table. The supervisor picked up Thomas's phone, examining the expensive model. "Nice phone. What do you do for work that gets you this kind of toy?" The question hung in the air, loaded with assumptions. Thomas recognized the implication that perhaps he couldn't legitimately afford such things. "I'm the CEO of Digital Front Technologies," Thomas answered simply. "We specialize in cybersecurity solutions." The officers exchanged quick glances, but their expressions didn't change. "We'll need to check this," the supervisor said, holding up Thomas's phone. "And we'll need the password." Thomas straightened in his chair. "My phone contains confidential business information protected by multiple NDAs. I cannot provide access without speaking to my legal team first." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Sir, refusal to comply with security procedures is a serious offense," the female officer said, her voice hardening. "I'm not refusing," Thomas clarified. "I'm requesting to call my attorney before granting access to proprietary information. I have rights, even in a security screening." The male officer stepped forward again. "Rights? You want to talk about rights? How about the right of these passengers to fly safely without people like you causing problems?" "People like me," Thomas repeated quietly, the words hanging in the air. The tension in the room snapped like a wire pulled too tight. The supervisor reached for his radio, his face flushed with anger. "That's it. We're done here," he barked into the radio. "Send backup to screening room 3. We're placing this individual under detention." Thomas's heart sank as he realized this situation was spiraling beyond his control. What had started as a simple request about his laptop was about to become something much more serious. The door to the screening room burst open as 2 airport police officers rushed in, hands already resting on their equipment belts. Thomas remained seated, perfectly still, his years of business training kicking in. Never show panic, never lose control of your emotions, especially when everything is falling apart around you. "Stand up slowly," one of the officers ordered, a stocky man with a crew cut and hard eyes. Thomas complied, rising with deliberate calmness. "Officers, there seems to be a misunderstanding." "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the officer cut him off. Thomas felt a chill run through his body. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now, not for simply asking someone to be careful with his laptop. But the faces around him showed no room for discussion. "I'd like to speak with a supervisor," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. "Or call my attorney." "You can do that after processing," said the second officer, a taller man with salt and pepper hair. Right now, you need to comply. Thomas looked at each face in the room, the TSA supervisor with arms crossed and jaw set, the female officer typing notes into a tablet, the male officer who seemed almost pleased by this turn of events. No one would meet his eye directly. May I ask what I'm being detained for? Thomas tried one more time, his lawyer's voice echoing in his head from years ago. Always get them to state the charge clearly. The stocky officer stepped forward, interfering with security procedures and threatening an officer. Threatening? Thomas couldn't hide his shock. I never threatened anyone. Sir, turn around now or we'll add resisting to the charges, the officer warned, his hand moving to his handcuffs. Thomas knew this moment would define everything that followed. Fighting would only make things worse. With 15 years of building a company from nothing, he'd learned when to stand firm and when strategic retreat was the wiser path. He turned around slowly, hands behind his back, dignity intact despite the humiliation burning through him. Cold metal closed around his wrists with a definitive click. My belongings, Thomas said quietly. My briefcase contains important business documents. They'll be cataloged and you can claim them later, the female TSA officer replied, already gathering his items. The officers guided Thomas toward the door. As they stepped out into the main terminal, the bright overhead lights felt like a stage spotlight. Travelers stopped to stare. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Someone gasped. Thomas held his head high, though shame burned through him. He had spent his entire career ensuring he was beyond reproach. Perfect academic record, impeccable business reputation, community service awards lining his office walls, all to avoid exactly this kind of moment. A young woman with copper-colored hair raised her phone, clearly recording the scene. Beyond her, a businessman in a suit similar to Thomas's watched with a furrowed brow. A family shielded their children's eyes, as if witnessing something shameful. That's not right, someone murmured as they passed. What did he do? Thomas caught fragments of whispered conversations. Must have done something serious. You never know these days. Should have just followed instructions. The walk through the terminal seemed endless. Each step in handcuffs stripped away another layer of the identity Thomas had built, respected CEO, industry leader, mentor, philanthropist. In these observers' eyes, he was reduced to just another person in custody, another assumption, another headline waiting to happen. They reached a side door marked Airport Security Personnel Only. As the toilet officer punched in a code, Thomas spotted an elderly man watching the scene with narrowed eyes. The man pulled out his phone and appeared to make a call, his gaze never leaving Thomas. Who was that? Thomas wondered. A reporter? A lawyer? Or just another traveler with a story to tell at dinner tonight? The door swung open to reveal a stark hallway, all concrete and fluorescent lights. As they led him through, Thomas heard the final boarding call for his flight to San Francisco. The meeting he would never make. The presentation stored on the laptop now being carried away by a TSA agent. Where are you taking me? Thomas asked as the door closed behind them, shutting out the watching eyes of the terminal. Processing, came the short reply. And then we'll see. Thomas took a deep breath. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He just had to stay calm, stay focused, and wait for the right moment to turn the situation around. The processing room was small and cold, with blank walls and a single metal table bolted to the floor. Thomas sat with his hands still cuffed behind him, the metal digging into his wrists. Across from him, the two officers sorted through his belongings, examining each item with exaggerated care. Nice watch, said the stocky officer, holding up Thomas's timepiece. Must have cost a pretty penny. Thomas remained silent. He'd learned long ago that sometimes saying nothing was the strongest move you could make. The taller officer flipped through Thomas's wallet, pulling out credit cards, membership cards, and finally his driver's license and business card. He stared at the business card for a long moment, then looked at Thomas with new interest. Digital Front Technologies? He asked, his tone changing slightly. You work there? I founded it, Thomas replied simply. I'm the CEO. The officers exchanged glances. The stocky one gave a small laugh. Right, and I'm the president. Google me, Thomas suggested calmly. Something in his confidence must have registered because the taller officer reached for his phone. He typed quickly, then stared at the screen. His expression shifted from disbelief to confusion, and finally to something that looked like concern. "Well?" asked his partner. Without answering, the officer turned his phone around. On the screen was Thomas's company profile, a professional headshot alongside his impressive bio. Founder and CEO of a billion-dollar cybersecurity firm, advisor to Fortune 500 companies, recent recipient of the Innovation Leadership Award, guest speaker at last month's National Security Technology Summit. The room fell silent. The stocky officer's smirk faded. "This doesn't change the situation," the taller officer finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You still interfered with security procedures." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "I asked an agent to be careful with my laptop. That's not interference. That's a reasonable request from a passenger concerned about valuable property." The door opened and a new figure entered, an older man in a suit rather than a uniform. He had silver hair and carried himself with authority. "I'm Director Phillips, head of security for this terminal," he said, looking between the officers and Thomas. "What's the situation here?" The officers straightened immediately. "Sir, this passenger was uncooperative during screening and—" "Remove those handcuffs," the director interrupted, staring at Thomas with growing recognition. "But sir, protocol states." "Now," the director ordered. The taller officer quickly complied, unlocking the handcuffs. Thomas brought his hands forward slowly, rubbing his wrists where the metal had dug into his skin. "Mr. Wilson," the director said, confirming he knew exactly who Thomas was. "I received 3 calls in the last 5 minutes about this incident. One from a board member of the airport authority who happened to witness your arrest. Another from a congressman who recognized you from last month's cybersecurity briefing on Capitol Hill." Thomas remained silent, letting the moment build. "And the third," the director continued, "from your company's chief legal officer, who informs me that footage of your detention is already circulating online." The officers seemed to shrink in their uniforms. The director turned to them, "Wait outside." After they left, Director Phillips sat down across from Thomas. "Mr. Wilson, I want to personally apologize for this situation. It appears there was a serious error in judgment by our staff." Thomas took a deep breath. "An error in judgment? Is that what we're calling racial profiling now?" The director flinched slightly but didn't deny it. "What can we do to make this right?" Thomas looked around the small room, thinking of the humiliation of being led through the terminal in handcuffs, of the missed meeting, of the countless other travelers who didn't have his resources or visibility. "For starters, you can return my belongings and arrange for transportation to San Francisco." "I've missed my flight." The director nodded quickly. "Of course. I'll arrange a private flight immediately." "And then," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger, "we need to have a much longer conversation about your training procedures and accountability measures." The director nodded again, relief washing over his face at Thomas's reasonable tone. "I should warn you," Thomas added, "that my company handles cybersecurity for several major airlines and government agencies. The irony of being detained as a security threat isn't lost on me." The color drained from the director's face as the full weight of the situation sank in. His career, his reputation, the airport's public image, all now hanging by a thread. "Mr. Wilson," he said, his voice nearly a whisper, "what would you like us to do next?" The next 7 minutes unfolded like a scene from a movie. Director Phillips scrambled to make things right, his earlier confidence replaced by barely concealed panic. Thomas watched the transformation with a calm that came from years of navigating corporate crisis. "Your belongings, Mr. Wilson," the director said, personally handing over Thomas's briefcase, wallet, and phone. His hands trembled slightly. "I verified everything is accounted for." Thomas checked his phone. 23 missed calls, 47 text messages. His chief of staff had already rescheduled the San Francisco meeting. His lawyer had sent 3 urgent messages asking for a call back immediately. But what caught Thomas's eye was the notification from a news app. "Breaking: Tech CEO detained at Kennedy Airport. Witnesses report racial profiling." The 2 officers who had handcuffed him now stood against the wall, eyes fixed on the floor. The female TSA agent who had been so stern earlier kept glancing nervously at the door, as if planning an escape route. Mr. Wilson, we have a private room upstairs where you can refresh yourself, Director Phillips offered. And I've arranged for a car to take you wherever you'd like to go. Thomas straightened his tie, a simple act that seemed to reclaim some of the dignity that had been stripped from him. First, I'd like my laptop examined for any damage. It contains sensitive information about government contracts. Of course, right away, the director said, signaling to an aide who rushed to comply. Thomas turned to face the officers who had arrested him. I'd like to know why I was singled out for additional screening when dozens of other business travelers passed through without issue. The room fell silent. No one wanted to state the obvious. Random selection, sir, the stocky officer finally mumbled, unable to meet Thomas's eyes. Random, Thomas repeated. Is that why the agent called me uncooperative when I simply asked him to handle my property with care? Is that why you found it necessary to handcuff me in front of hundreds of travelers? Was that all random too? Sweat beaded on the officer's forehead. Sir, we were following protocol. Thomas finished for him. Which protocol calls for handcuffing a passenger who has made no threats and shown no resistance? The director stepped in. Mr. Wilson, I assure you this is not how we train our staff to behave. These officers will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Thomas turned to him. And what about the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place? Will that be investigated too? The door opened and a distinguished older woman entered, the airport's general manager, based on her identification badge. Her face was tight with concern. Mr. Wilson, I'm Grace Chen, general manager. I came as soon as I heard. This is completely unacceptable, and I want to personally apologize on behalf of the entire airport. Thomas nodded but remained standing. He was done being asked to sit down and wait. The mayor's office called. Grace continued, her voice lowered slightly. And 2 news vans are outside. We'd like to offer whatever assistance we can to resolve this situation discreetly. Thomas understood what was happening. They weren't concerned about him. They were worried about themselves, about lawsuits and bad publicity and careers derailed. I appreciate that, Thomas said carefully. But I don't think discreet is the right approach here. He held up his phone, showing them the social media feeds already filling with eyewitness accounts and blurry photos of his arrest. This isn't just about me. How many others go through this without the benefit of my resources or connections? How many don't get this special treatment after the fact? The room fell silent again. Grace and the director exchanged glances. What would you like us to do? Grace asked, echoing the director's earlier question. Thomas looked around the room at the faces watching him anxiously, people who 7 minutes ago had all the power, who had stripped him of his dignity without a second thought. Now they were practically begging for mercy. For starters, Thomas said, his voice level but firm, I want to speak with each of the officers involved. Not for an apology, though that would be appropriate, but to understand exactly what happened and why. He turned to Grace. Then I want a complete review of your training procedures with input from diversity experts my company will provide. The general manager nodded quickly, relief visible on her face at the reasonable requests. And finally, Thomas continued, I want. His phone rang, interrupting him. The caller ID showed it was his company's head of public relations. Excuse me, Thomas said. I need to take this. It seems we all have a bigger situation to manage now. By sunset, the video had gone viral. Thomas watched the footage for the first time in his hotel room, seeing himself through the eyes of strangers, being handcuffed, walking through the terminal with his head held high despite the humiliation burning in his eyes. Someone had added dramatic music in the background. The view count was already over 2 million. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since he'd left the airport. News networks wanted interviews. Civil rights organizations offered support. His board members called with concern. His mother called twice, her voice tight with worry despite his reassurances. You should sue them, his lawyer had advised during their call an hour ago. We could get millions in damages. Thomas stared out the hotel window at the city lights below. Money wasn't the issue. It never had been. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His chief of staff entered, carrying a tablet. You might want to see this, she said, handing him the device. It was a live news broadcast. The anchor was mid-sentence. Footage has sparked outrage across social media, with the hashtag #FlyingWileCEO trending nationwide. Airport authorities have issued a statement apologizing for what they call a regrettable incident, but critics are calling for more substantial action. The camera cut to a group of protesters gathering outside the airport, holding signs demanding accountability and better training. "It's bigger than just you now," his chief of staff said quietly. Thomas nodded. He'd known this would happen the moment he saw the phones recording in the terminal. His private humiliation had become a public conversation, another example in a long pattern that many recognized all too well. His phone rang again. This time it was the mayor, calling to personally apologize and ask how the city could make this right. After the call, Thomas sat at the desk and began writing. Not a lawsuit, but something more meaningful, a proposal. By midnight, he had a comprehensive plan drafted. A new training program for airport security staff nationwide, focused on recognizing and avoiding bias in security protocols. 3 days later, Thomas stood at a podium in the airport's main conference room. Behind him stood the airport director, the head of TSA, and several community leaders. Cameras flashed as he spoke. "What happened to me last week was not unique," Thomas began, his voice steady. "The only unique part was that I had the resources and platform to ensure it didn't end the way these incidents usually do, swept under the rug, forgotten by everyone except the person it happened to." He outlined his proposal for the new training program, which the airport had not only accepted but funded generously. The 2 officers who had arrested him had been required to meet with him personally as part of their sensitivity training. The conversation had been uncomfortable but necessary, a first step toward real understanding. "I could have pursued legal action," Thomas continued. "Instead, I chose to pursue change. This isn't about punishment, it's about progress." Social media buzzed with approval. His company's stock price rose 12% that week, not that this had been his goal. The real victory came a month later, when reports showed a 40% decrease in passenger complaints about discriminatory treatment at the airport. 2 months after the incident, Thomas received an invitation to speak at a national conference on security and public trust. As he prepared his presentation, he reflected on how a 7-minute nightmare had transformed into something powerful. His phone buzzed with a text message from his daughter. "Dad, we're studying your airport case in my social justice class. The teacher said you turned a personal injustice into systemic change. I'm so proud of you." Thomas smiled. This was the legacy he wanted, not just as a successful businessman, but as someone who used his position to make things better for those who would come after him. 6 months later, the training program Thomas had designed was being implemented at airports across the country. He had received letters from security personnel thanking him for helping them recognize their own biases. He had also received messages from travelers who felt they were being treated with more dignity and respect. The 7 minutes that had nearly destroyed his dignity had become the catalyst for years of meaningful change. As Thomas boarded his flight to his next speaking engagement, the TSA agent checking his ID smiled with genuine respect. "Thank you for your work, Mr. Wilson," she said quietly. "You've made a difference here." Thomas nodded and moved forward, head held high, not in defiance this time, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the most important outcomes.